Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. In college, I took a class called The Sociology of Religion. One day, the professor showed us a movie about snake-handling churches in a deeply rural area. In case you don't know what that is, in some of these very fundamentalist and Pentecostal churches, they literally pick up poisonous snakes and drink strychnine as a test of their faith. It's based on a passage in Mark 16 that almost all biblical scholars think was added to the gospel years later, and it says that if one truly has faith, then poisonous serpents and poison won't affect you. So as part of their worship in these churches, they take out snakes and drink the poison to prove the extent of their faith. I still remember that they interviewed one elderly lady, and she talked about how worthless those pastors were who went to the cemetery. You see, she substituted the word cemetery for the word seminary. She was saying that going to seminary killed true faith because the people who went to seminary usually didn't support the snake-handling kind of faith which she believed in. Well, I went to seminary, and I'd have to agree with her that I don't support snake handling, and you won't find me doing it. And I think Moses would agree with me. And I think the fact that he did handle a snake is a powerful testimony to the level of his faith. This week we're looking at the stories of serpents in the Bible, and today we turn to one that you might not automatically think of. You will perhaps remember that in the time of Moses, the Hebrew people were slaves in Egypt. As it happened, Moses ended up killing someone who was beating a slave and fled from Egypt. In the land of Midian, he got married and was out tending the sheep one day when he saw a bush that seemed to be aflame and wasn't being burned up. Moses went over to investigate and ended up in an encounter with God. God told Moses that he was the one who would lead the Hebrew people out of Israel, and right away Moses began to make excuses. Send someone else. I don't speak well. I don't even know your name. There was excuse after excuse, a lot like we tend to make excuses when God calls us to do something out of our comfort zone. There was one excuse that did seem to make sense, however. Moses said, "If I go to your people and tell them that God spoke to me and I am to lead them out, they will roll their eyes and ask what proof I have that God told me all these things." Well, that's a reasonable expectation. If someone shows up telling me God spoke to them directly, then most of the time I'm a bit skeptical. Moses expected that's how he would be received as well. So God told him to take his rod, probably his shepherd's crook, and throw it on the ground. And when he did, it became a snake. Well, Moses did what any self-respecting person would do when confronted by a snake. He turned and ran away. But God told him to go back and pick up the snake by the tail. What? It's one thing to talk to a burning bush. Picking up a snake has some very real danger. I can only imagine Moses' fear and hesitancy as he turned back and approached that snake. Perhaps you know how this ended. Moses did grab that snake by the tail, and it turned into his rod again. God said that should be enough to convince the Hebrew people that Moses had indeed been sent from God. I think what this serpent points out to us is that the demands of faith aren't always easy. The life of faith can present us challenges, and in fact it is in those times of challenge when we may be most assured that it is faith. But in those times, God never leaves us. Rather, God accompanies us in life, going before us and with us always. We may not like handling the snakes God puts before us, but we don't just go, we go with God. Here, so early on, Moses seemed to know that, and so he picked up that snake and set on his way back to Egypt to lead the people to freedom. Which leads us to the question of what God may be calling us to do. What snakes has he called us to handle in our lives of faith? How do we get beyond our own fears in order to be the body of Christ in the world? The ELCA slogan is God's work, our hands. May we do God's work in spite of our fears, no matter what. No matter what. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.